All right. Hi, everyone. It's Stephanie with the Patient Story, and I have been really excited for this conversation that's supposed to happen today, right now, with Dr. Mark Lewis for a while. Dr. Lewis, Mark, is the director of GI oncology at Intermountain, and that's in Utah, right, Mark? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself as Mark and also yourself as Dr. Lewis?
I appreciate you sort of identifying my sort of two parts of my identity, Stephanie, and thank you for having me. This is a real thrill for me too. So one thing you're kind of alluding to right off the bat is I'm not just an oncologist, I'm also a person. And I think we can start with the breaking news that oncologists are human beings. And frankly, that's not a foregone conclusion. We have a pretty nasty reputation that's come about because people naturally associate us with our treatments. And our treatments have an unfortunate legacy of a lot of indiscriminate toxicity. And so one of the reasons I'm happy to do this is I want people to see that, doctors, especially oncologists, come to medicine for actually pretty compelling and emotional reasons, often more than their attraction to the science. And we can talk about that sort of bicameral mind where it's both head and heart and that kind of stuff. But let me start by answering your question. So yeah, I practice at Intermountain, which is a beautiful description of where I am. So I work in Utah. I'm licensed in 6 states in this region, and we cover basically a pretty vast expanse. Once you go west of the Rockies and then sort of up towards the Pacific Northwest and across Nevada, we cover that area. And it's actually really great that I'm talking to you because in the last year in particular, we were already doing telehealth. But the pandemic has sort of forced us to increase our bandwidth and our ability to be facile with this kind of technology. So now I can talk to people, states away. And is it exactly the same as being together in the same room? Well, no. And there is a lot of oncology actually that is appropriately tactile. But that aside, it really has been a very rewarding experience. And we've actually had people tell us, if they hadn't had access to telehealth and teleoncology, they would have just stayed where they were and foregone any treatment whatsoever. And so I can actually cite examples of people whose lives have been saved by Zoom, which is kind of remarkable. But yeah, that's where I'm at. And it's a very different practice environment. I came here from MD Anderson Cancer Center, which is a well-known research center in Houston. And the model there was, you're going to come to us. So obviously a major metropolitan center. We had patients literally from all over the world. And unfortunately, a lot of the people coming there had exhausted conventional treatment options. And so they were invested. One term that is used for folks like that is medical tourists. Sometimes people say that almost as if they're denigrating the patient. I don't like that. I think what it's pointing out is there's this select group who are sick enough to need sort of next level treatment, not so sick that they can't travel, and then also with some means, at least, to be able to essentially move to another city to get care. And while I found that very rewarding, I would actually much rather take care of people where they live. And that, again, is what we're increasingly trying to do with teleoncology. And finally, I was sort of working backwards through my career. I did my training at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. So there, again, it was a center almost literally in the middle of the frozen tundra. It's a remarkable place to visit because most people drive down from Minneapolis, St. Paul, and you're just going through cornfields, and it's beautiful. And then all of a sudden you see like these glimmering towers in the distance, and it's Mayo Clinic, and boom, you're in a world-class medical center. So there again, almost by necessity, where it was located, yes, we catered to the local community, but next to like my Minnesota farmer was someone that might have traveled from Saudi Arabia to get the latest cancer treatment. It was an amazing place to train. But again, it wasn't really representative of the American public. And then lastly, the reason I came to Utah is, well, twofold. I'm part of a dual physician couple. So my wife's a pediatrician, and this is the youngest state in the nation. The average age here is 30. And I think 1 in 4 people are between kindergarten and 12th grade. But that also means for me, there's this really compelling, if troubling, problem here of young adult cancer. So there's various definitions for that. The most conventional one in the US is people affected by cancer, either a liquid tumor like leukemia or a solid tumor like colon or breast, anytime between age 15 and 39. And this has been an amazing place to deal with that particular demographic because everyone here is, or not everyone, but many people are young.
Right.
So 1 in 7 people in my practice fit that demographic. And taking care of them is just, it can be heartbreaking, but it can also be super satisfying, because if you can cure someone like that, that's decades of life that you're giving back to them. And so we can talk about that too. So that, in a nutshell, is kind of my, I don't know, my oncologic pedigree and how I got here.
I was 30, 31 when I was diagnosed. I really want to say thank you for the work that you do.
Well,
yeah.
That's very gracious of you. It's been an amazing movement. It really has only existed for, gosh, at the most 30 years that we've had this recognition that this is a group apart. And unfortunately, in that 30 years, while there's been a lot of progress, there's also been a lot of growth in the demographic, and not in a good way. So one thing that I deal with as a GI oncologist is colon cancer, which we used to think of as a disease largely of senescence. And we used to set the screening age, 50 or older. It's happening younger people. And, the example I give, which is tragic and extremely well known, is I was sitting at home last summer watching Black Panther with my son on a Friday night. And my cell phone starts blowing up, and it's all my friends, many of whom are non-medical, asking if I had known that Chadwick Boseman died of metastatic colon cancer. And I was just absolutely floored. I was watching the guy be a superhero on the screen. And he's a perfect example, actually, of, you can be young, you can be healthy, you can be incredibly fit, you can have resources, and you can still get cancer. And so one of the things we want to touch on is the false shame and blame that is placed on cancer patients. It's a disease that has actually long suffered from stigma. For decades, I think the New York Times actually had a ban. I think it was specifically on the phrase breast cancer. This was decades ago, but regardless, it goes to show you that, we haven't entirely come away from that. And especially online, there's a lot of unfortunate finger pointing, especially when someone young gets cancer. The assumption is, oh, you must have done something wrong. And apart from it, it's usually not anything the patient did. It's some unfortunate combination of genetics and circumstance.
You also fit in that category, because you were around 30. It was what I remember when you were touched personally by cancer in the most personal way you can be. And so I wanted to dive into this conversation with that as a starting point. You were starting your specific cancer medical training, Mayo Clinic. You talked about that. It was 2009. You started feeling some bad abdominal pain. And then you embarked on this sort of journey of self-diagnosis. So bring us back a little bit to what that was like and what happened. Yeah,
well, actually, let me go back even further than that, because it turns out in hindsight that the story really begins earlier. So the reason I went into oncology, so not just medicine, but oncology, is when I was 8 years old, my father was diagnosed with cancer. And the circumstances were, they're never going to be ideal, but this was particularly almost Kafka-esque, because what happened was we were moving to the States. When you immigrate here, you have to get a chest X-ray as a public health measure to exclude tuberculosis. So we got this call from the government saying, well, there's a good news, bad news here. The good news is you don't have TB, talking to my dad. The bad news, and he's a 42-year-old at the time, the bad news is there's something occupying your entire right lung. And when you get to America, you should probably have that investigated. And the phone, click. So that's a lot to handle when you're moving country. Then there's like some ranking of stressors, and one of them is moving. I think the other is, getting a major diagnosis, and this was both at once. And also, frankly, we had to learn the American healthcare system. So, the National Health Service in the UK is far from perfect, but one of the things it's really good at is avoiding or minimizing financial toxicity for patients. And we got here, and thankfully my dad had a job, but it was still tens of thousands of dollars out of pocket for his care. He required his entire right lung to be removed. He required radiation and chemo after that. And so I know this sounds like, well, boy, after all this, why would you want to go into cancer medicine? It's because his oncologist was so good. And my dad did pass away, but his oncologist kind of took me under his wing. And then every summer in high school and college, I had other jobs, worked in movie theater and stuff, but I also had I knew I had a job that I could go to as a medical assistant at this clinic. And it was the same clinic where my dad had been treated. So, at first there was kind of it felt a little strange going back there. But sooner or later, everyone just kind of got used to me, didn't treat me any differently than any other employee. And so I, learned by shadowing this guy, how he did oncology. And one of the things I loved about it was I sensed how close he got to his patients. I know that sounds, in this era, it sounds almost improper to say that, but it's true. You get a really deep kinship. I can say that, kinship with your patients. I stopped short of saying friendship because I know there's a power dynamic, and I know when you're the oncologist and the other person's the patient, it's difficult to ever quite erase that imbalance. But regardless, I saw what he did, and what he did. This is back in the era of paper charts. So before he went in the room to see a patient, and you let me follow him, he had written all the relevant medical stuff in the center, but then in the margins, you would have these like tiny little details, kind of the grace notes of someone's identity, like. And then he would remember to ask them about like their child playing a baseball game, or how was this trip that you took. And I was like, wow, he's really taking the time to learn about these people. They're not just the hosts for a tumor, which is how some patients in oncology are made to feel. They're really they're people to him. And that was actually borne out by the fact that the book that my dad wrote while he was dying, it took 7 years for it to get published. It got published posthumously, and he actually showed up completely to our surprise on the book launch. And that was 7 years after my father had passed. And we were just absolutely blown away. That was just the kind of connection he had. Anyway, so fast forward, as you said, I'm starting my oncology training. Day one, I woke up with this horrible abdominal pain, which, naturally, you could attribute to nerves. Like, it's kind of overwhelming to be at Mayo and like starting and embarking on your fellowship. But when I went to get checked out, one of the other things I thought it might be was appendicitis, because it sort of felt like it was in the right lower quadrant. And it wasn't. It was a high calcium level. And why is that relevant? My dad had suffered from that his whole life. No one had ever really figured that part out. And people had told him, oh, you're eating too much dairy. Again, this whole sort of shifting the blame to the patient. And my dad fastidiously eliminated all that stuff. Still suffered from high calcium, kidney stones, GI issues. Anyway, when I realized I had that too, the way I've described it, and I don't think it's hyperbolic, is, you can look at the stars for a long time, and then all of a sudden you can see a constellation, you can see a pattern. And that's what I saw. And I was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time, just enough training to say, oh my goodness, there's really only a couple conditions that give you consecutive generations of high calcium. And one of them is a neuroendocrine tumor syndrome called multiple endocrine neoplasia type 1. And in hindsight, it explained everything about my dad. And again, his oncologist was wonderful, and I clearly, idolized the man. But he never kind of put two and two together about what was causing my dad's cancer. It was always, dealing with what we had to confront. But no one ever got to the bottom of why it happened. In fact, the reason I bring that up again, Stephanie, is my father was a Protestant minister. He was a theologian. He thought a lot about guilt and sin. And I kind of wonder if in that framework, he didn't end up blaming himself far too much. So for instance, as I mentioned, the mass started in his chest. So sometimes described to us rather inexactly as a lung cancer. It wasn't really. But then he wondered, oh gosh, I've never smoked, but did I spend too much time around secondhand smoke? And anyway, there was all this sort of, retrospection he went through. And among other reasons, I miss my dad. I kind of wish I could tell him, it wasn't your fault. Anyway, so when I realized there was this connection, then I kind of all fit. And I was starting my cancer training. So I was at Mayo, which is famously a wonderful place to be diagnosed with something esoteric. I didn't think I would be doing it myself. And I went to my internist assigned to, and frankly, I don't blame him. He thought I was a hypochondriac, day one of oncology training, coming in saying I have a tumor syndrome, claiming all kinds of outlandish things about my family tree. Like, I realized how lucky I am, because if I was any other patient, if I didn't have the ability to play the card of professional courtesy, I think I'd have been written off, at least for a while. And also, you can't ethically order things on yourself. So I needed someone to do the diagnostic work for me. And so I basically kind of twisted his arm and said, hey, listen, just take a bet on me. If I'm wrong, but I think I'm right. And and sure enough, I was. And then, I disclosed that to the people that were running my training program because I thought it was important that they knew. And they could not have been more supportive. And what's really interesting, and this is where I want to come back to what we said at the very beginning. I have a pet theory that oncologists are more likely to have dealt with cancer themselves than almost any other specialty. And where I'm getting at that, Stephanie, is obviously the way I inherited my disease is what's called autosomal dominant. So there's a 50-50 chance I was going to get it from my dad. The link's not always quite that strong. But my point is, many of us come to this field because yes, the science is amazing and the pace of research is absolutely mind-boggling. But most of us come to it because we've known someone with cancer. And sometimes that's a friend. More often it's a relative. And if it's a relative, that means there's some sort of blood linkage and presumably some even slightly heightened risk that you might deal with it yourself. And what I want your audience to know is, again, I was at Mayo dealing with these world-class oncologists, and so many of them, I won't reveal their identities, took me aside, after I disclosed my own problem. And they're like, yeah, I've dealt with cancer too. And like, it blew my mind. And
It's amazing.
And I think that's why this field is so, obviously it's emotional what we do, dealing with people that grapple with their own mortality and sometimes at a very young age. But I think that a lot of us do this because we're trying to help other people when maybe we couldn't even help our own relatives. And I know I feel that way about my father.
Yeah, that is so powerful. Thank you for sharing that. And
Yeah.
it's a big reason why I wanted to have this conversation with you, sort of behind the white coat kind of, let's humanize, right?
Yes.
Because obviously
Yes.
when people come into this arena, everyone's overwhelmed. You're dealing with cancer. It's a very scary word. And so people are already in this very particular mindset. And then you see the doctor and it's kind of this, I want to be a good patient and I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
So I think humanizing even just the role, the job description of what an oncologist is, why he or she does what they do is so important. You talked about how you had to basically advocate for yourself, right? And I'd read somewhere in a different interview that you said sort of this self-diagnosis journey can raise eyebrows from the medical community. And, coming from someone who's already a physician, that's one thing. For patients who are often told, don't, just listen or we know better. I'm just curious what your message is now that, because you've stood on every sort of corner of this sort of, position here, the situation. Yeah. What's your message to people about that?
Yes. So I think the paradigm you're describing, and I know it still exists in some places, is paternalism, where the doctor has all the power. And I actually was telling someone yesterday, because we were having a really wonderful kind of conversation about the pros and cons of really 3 different options. We'll talk about how you make it so it's not a la carte medicine for the patient, but they still feel empowered to make choices. We'll get to that. But anyway, it used to be someone like me in a white coat, very stern, comes in, first appointment, you've got cancer. We kind of brush that aside very quickly, and then we tell you what you're going to do. That used to be the exchange, and it felt very kind of unidirectional. What I would tell patients now, Stephanie, is, we live in the information age. We have more access to information than we've ever had before. And I realize, again, that the playing field is not perfectly level. One of the things that frustrates me, even as a self-advocating patient, is when I try to get really deep in the weeds and research things, I sometimes come up against paywalls. So a lot of research, even publicly and federally funded research, ends up being put in journals that are financially inaccessible. It's not uncommon, and you may have done this. If you're trying to get a single article, one article, it might cost you like $60 just to get your hands on that one, piece of paper. That really, really frustrates me. And then honestly, some of our research findings are necessarily behind closed doors. And what I mean by that is, they're not ready for prime time yet. Unfortunately, oncology is littered with examples of things that have been biologically plausible or even looked very promising in very early phases of drug development, but then they don't actually work when you put them out and study them either in the human body, so going from a test tube to a person, or in large groups of people, especially in a randomized clinical trial. So those two things aside, though, I would argue that most patients have access to the same information their doctors do. The question is, how do you filter it? Because as you well know, an engine like Google is incredible, but it's also gameable. Google is not, it's not a completely altruistic organization. There's a reason you get this in exchange. The transaction is you, it's your information. Regardless, where I want to empower patients is, if you feel like, this is what I'll say, if you feel there's something wrong with you and you feel like your doctor is not helping you deal with it, you are entitled to a second opinion. And one of the things I say is, if you ask for a second opinion and your doctor says no, that is a reason to get a second opinion. Because any doc these days who thinks they know it all, especially in oncology, is absolutely kidding themselves. There is so much to know. I don't know. I know a lot of smart people. I don't know anybody who knows everything. I would say to patients, and I guess this is kind of just different phases. There's the part where you're getting diagnosed, and then there's a part where you're going through treatment. I actually think the diagnosis part can take quite a bit longer. And so patients with my condition, I'm not alone in that it takes on average something like 7 years or even a decade for someone with a neuroendocrine tumor, which is my tumor type, to get diagnosed. And the reason is, Stephanie, it looks like so many other things. So one of the classic ways this presents is something called Carcinoid Syndrome, which really broken down means cancer-like syndrome. And even that's a misnomer because it can be a real cancer. But regardless, these patients have a very classic, again, constellation of findings. So they'll get very, very flushed. They might wheeze, and then they have horrible diarrhea, the latter of which is not easy for people to disclose. But here's the problem is, there's that whole parable about, I think it's the blind men are feeling the elephant, and they're each feeling a different part and concluding it's a different animal. Depending on which specialist you go to, they have anchoring bias on their discipline. So if you go to a pulmonologist with the wheezing, they might diagnose you with adult onset asthma. If you go to a gastroenterologist with diarrhea, they might say, oh, it's irritable bowel syndrome. And then for women in particular, and there's a lot to dive into here, they're often misdiagnosed with the flushing. They're told, oh, it's perimenopausal hot flashes. And so because you start sort of accumulating all these different and wrong labels, it can be very, very difficult to expunge those from your chart and then finally arrive at the right diagnosis. And so what I'm getting at here is patients like me tend to have a history of either misdiagnosis or delayed diagnosis. And during this whole process, no matter how long it takes, you're still inhabiting your body all the time. And something's wrong and you just can't put your finger on it. And then presumably all these treatments that are being sort of assigned to you are probably also not helping as much as they're supposed to. And that's very frustrating. So I give patients a lot of credit because I even when they're on treatment now, I tell them, listen, you are you all the time. At the most, I get to see you once a week. Most of my folks I see every other week on treatment. And frankly, one of the huge advances in the last couple of years has been real-time communication with patients. There's a really famous study, you might actually know of it, but it was presented at one of our meetings in 2017. And as is often the case at oncology conferences, it was a survival curve. And what that means is you've got two lines, and one line shows you how people are doing with intervention A, and the other with intervention B. And what I'm telling you is, if you put up just the slide, just the curves, and you saw the separation between these two groups, you'd be like, oh my gosh, whatever drug they're giving to group A, this is $1 billion product. This is going to be like blowing the doors off and changing the standard of care. And it wasn't a drug. It was a computer program based on people's cell phones where they could just note in real time when they were having symptoms. And then that fed back into a system involving nurses and doctors where they could respond in real time. And that was the survival difference. And so my point is just listening to people and listening to them as close to their present experience as possible. That is so powerful. And another statistic that's kind of amazing / scary is if we halted all oncology research today, just stopped experimenting and just applied what we already know, we'd probably save close to 100,000 lives a year. And what that tells you is the science is awesome, but there's a huge lag in implementation. And some of that also comes down to payment. So the trap I sometimes fall into is I'll come back from one of these conferences and I'll be giddy with enthusiasm about some new treatment. And I sometimes overpromise to my patients or overdisclose, and I can't actually get it to them. So one thing I say all the time, and your audience will know this, is there's the practice of medicine, which is what I do, it's what I've trained to do. And there's the business of healthcare, which is this whole other incredibly complicated, often Byzantine infrastructure. And the two are not the same at all. Like the training to go into one or the other is completely different. I have friends actually who have been so invested in understanding business that they've gone and gotten masters in health administration. But those people are the exception, not the rule. Most of us do oncology, and this is true. Most of us have absolutely no idea. When we prescribe something to you, we don't know how much it's going to cost. We don't know often if your insurance is going to approve it up front, if we're going to have to appeal, if that's going to take time. And time is the ultimate currency. I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're Jeff Bezos. You can't buy time. And especially with oncology, it drives me crazy because, like you were saying, Stephanie, there's that initial encounter with the oncologist. I don't know about you, but a lot of my patients tell me they don't really hear or retain much of that first visit beyond just the confirmation that there's cancer. And then the last thing you want to do once you know that you have cancer is wait, right? There's this fierce urgency that comes to the diagnosis. Oh my gosh, like we know this now, let's act on it. And frankly, it breaks my heart sometimes because I have someone, I've met them, I've told them, okay, we need to do X, Y, Z, and I've cited, this amount of evidence. But if I can't get that to you, that is just, it's beyond frustrating. It's frightening. And that's the part that makes me the most angry. I hope I don't come across as an angry person, but I have a righteous indignation when it comes to my patients. Because once you're my patient, again, without sounding paternalistic, I'm very protective that I now have taken on a responsibility for you. And that sometimes involves fighting with insurance companies. Now, not all insurance companies are bad, okay? And I'm not going to name names here. I certainly have some I like more than others. But it is difficult for the insurance companies to give them credit to keep their policies going at the same pace, the same tempo as the discoveries. So again, the biggest problem in modern oncology, in my opinion, is getting the stuff we know works to the patient in a timely enough fashion. Okay, so that was a lot said. But back to empowering the patients. One thing I've been very interested in is sometimes you get to a crossroads in someone's treatment, and there is more than one option that you can reasonably pursue. So what I'll often do is kind of spill out to the patient, we could do A, B, or C. And I try to sort of build in a risk-benefit calculus, if you will, to each option. And it's very interesting, Stephanie, because it's almost half and half. And again, remember, I've got some young patients, but the average age of my patient is 68. And it's probably from the generation is more used to the doctor telling them what to do. Some of my patients tell me, listen, you pick. I don't want the burden of picking. Others are deeply interested in sort of researching which path we're going to go down. And I give them the time and hopefully the information so they can do that. But it's really fascinating. Like we want to offer autonomy, but we don't want the weight of that to be too hefty. And again, I see a lot of patients coming in and they've done a lot of homework online. But one of my favorite things that happens these days to really flip the script around is a patient will tell me about a trial that I haven't even heard of. Like, again, no oncologist knows everything. And because there's new studies opening up all the time, even those of us who really try to keep our finger on the pulse, we don't know it all. And so occasionally a patient will come in and they've gone to clinicaltrials.gov, right? The central clearinghouse for all this. And they've put in an appropriate search string. They're like, hey, Dr. Lewis, would this be right for me? And then we read over it together and either yes or no, but it's a really cool process. If you can get to the point where you can have true dialogue, not be worried about, offending your doctor's sensibilities or whatever. Here I will invoke an older generation. So my Scottish grandmother, bless her heart, so she was in her 90s, had a heart attack on a Sunday, so crushing chest pain, and didn't call anybody until Monday morning, and survived. And we asked why. She said, "Oh, you don't bother the doctor." and so I'll often say that to my patients. I'm like, you very much bother the doctor. That's what we're here for. In my group, we're fortunate we have a a system where we trade off, but we cover our clinic 24/7 because we want, if you're having a heart attack, we want to know about it. And the other thing is, there's a lot we can tell about you from labs and scans. But as I mentioned earlier, you're the ultimate sort of surveillance system for your own body. Mm-hmm. And without making it too onerous on the patient, there are certain side effects I just can't see. The classic one, and this is appropriate across a variety of different tumor types, is neuropathy. So a lot of the drugs that we give in oncology, unfortunately, have a really nasty downside, which is potentially permanent nerve damage. And the problem with it is usually once it happens, it is not reversible. And so it's kind of a case where an ounce of prevention is a pound of cure. And the only way we can mitigate it often is to be extremely careful with our dosing up front. So all my patients know, like I'm on them constantly, how are your nerves this cycle? How are they now? And the reason I do that is I know that some of these drugs I just can't take back. And as I mentioned with Mayo is a world-class center for multiple myeloma, so a plasma cell disorder. And classically, the drugs that they use in multiple myeloma can cause neuropathy. So I'll never forget this. You tend to remember your mistakes more than your successes. I was in training. I was presenting to, if I'm honest, a pretty fearsome myeloma professor. He was the chair of the department. He's a very imposing man. And I suppose I was trying to placate him. Anyway, I described to him that a patient, quote, this is my exact words, only had grade 2 neuropathy. And he stopped me and he said, "You will never say that again." He said, "You'll never say only about someone's side effect." And he's absolutely right, because on this scale, grade 2 neuropathy means you have constant numbness and tingling. It's not anything that you would want. And so the other thing I guess I'll point out as a patient is the phrases that drive me the craziest in oncology are the rhetoric that tries to minimize side effects. And the phrase that I hate the most, if I'm very honest, is manageable toxicity. So often what you'll find at a scientific conference is a drug might actually work very well, it may be highly effective, but as we hinted at the very beginning, might also be extremely toxic. And so what will happen is you'll see these researchers, and understandably they're excited to share their findings, but sometimes an attempt to sugarcoat whatever this new treatment is, they'll throw that phrase in. And the reason I find it so objectionable, it's almost sophistry, is when they say that, my retort is always like, well, if it's so manageable, would you want to take this drug yourself? And it's really interesting. If you poll oncologists, and I think this has actually been done sort of formally, but you can do it informally too, and say, hey, would you be willing to take XYZ? Many people would say no. When I was at Mayo, again in myeloma, I came across this chemo recipe we were giving. And I'll be honest, Stephanie, I thought it was a misprint. It was 7 drugs put together. And I was like, there's no way. There's absolutely no way this is an accurate acronym. And sure enough, it is. It's a 7-drug regimen. And there's many of us who, if you really put our feet to the fire, would not accept the very things that we have been trained to prescribe. And that kind of, I guess I'll say it, hypocrisy has also not served us well in terms of our public image. So the goal, and I tell my patients this all the time, is to marry effectiveness to tolerability, right? And especially if you're a young person and I think you can live for decades, I want you to live for decades with a good quality of life. And that's the tough part is, sometimes to get to cure, you have to basically put the patient through just the most exquisite rigors. Absolutely. Like a bone marrow transplant or something. But if you can get them out the other side and they are relatively intact, that's the goal.
It's been so powerful for people, who come in as patients and as caregivers to know, hey, it's not just Dr. Lewis. This Mark guy has shared his story so vulnerably and so openly. It really is powerful. I mean, I think patient stories or storytelling is such a buzzword, buzz phrase, but when people actually do it and they do it authentically, it really is incredibly moving. And that's what we've seen, obviously, at the patient story with people opening up. And so this is kind of a segue into another part of how you open up, which I think makes you more accessible, which is you are present online. You have, and we only have like a few minutes, but really, I could talk to you about this for like hours.
Yeah, yeah.
Because the way I actually found you was on Twitter.
Yes.
I remember I saw things that you were, writing, and I thought, this guy is so funny. And what he's saying is spot on. And I'd seen you talk about things like about the second opinion, what you talked about earlier. You need to, at the time when the doctor's saying don't get a second opinion is when you should get a second opinion.
Exactly.
Also, just kind of giving permission, I think, for people to see oncologists as more than just these talking heads or men and women in the white coats. So
Yes.
Talk to us a little bit about, your philosophy when it comes to being open and so communicative.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And you're right. There's a lot of fodder for further conversation there, but I'll just say, like, in my career, which has not been that long, I've seen social media go from something that was considered frivolous and unprofessional for a doctor and certainly an oncologist to something that's almost become, it's not mandatory, it's strongly encouraged. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, you mentioned humanizing us. So I think you know this, I think we might have talked about this before, but I did a Google search where I let the search engine auto-complete the phrase oncologists are. And what came up, at least for me, was oncologists are murderers, oncologists are criminals, oncologists are poisoners, like all this stuff. And I was like, holy smokes, this is the top answers on Google. I was like, I got to do something about this. And, you feel like a tiny drop in a big ocean, but I thought, well, one thing I can do is be open. Now, with that, I'll say a couple of things. Vulnerability is the right word, because you do make yourself potentially a target. I've very seldom, thankfully, but I've dealt with trolls, dealt with death threats at one point, dealt with pedophilia towards my children. I mean, all these really, really horrible things. But thankfully, that is the tiny, tiny fraction of my social media experience. But some of my peers look at that and they want nothing to do with it. I don't blame them. However, it's also become a tool, if I'm being very honest, for oncologists' professional development. Because as I mentioned earlier, there is so much to know. And what we can do as doctors is use it to refine our own sort of information stream. I mean, if I just sat and tried to read every cancer research article that came out, I wouldn't be able to do it. I certainly wouldn't be able to practice at the same time. There's some point where you just get oversaturated. And frankly, it's not all equally meritorious either. So one of the things that's good about Twitter, and this may not be so visible, is using it as a curation tool for us. Also is important because it lets you see what matters to patients. And if you listen to advocates, you learn a lot. You learn that, these endpoints that we have in oncology, so the ones that matter really are, you already talked about them, survival and quality of life. We have almost countless other metrics that we like to use to say, oh, treatment X is better than treatment Y. Very few of them matter to patients. And at the end of the day, they're often just very poor surrogates, if they're surrogates at all, for living longer and living better, okay? And then finally, and thank you for identifying this, tone on Twitter, in fact, I tweeted about this morning, is really, really hard because, there's no font. You can't really broadcast clearly when you're being sarcastic versus being genuine. So I've learned try not to be the former. But tone is really tricky. And one of the things I'm told is, sometimes I tweet about heavy stuff. People are dying. And then people are like, oh, you're so serious and maudlin. And then I try to be, comical, like, oh, you're being far too glib for an oncologist. And so it's like, you can't please everyone all the time. But I love the conversations that happen on there. I love the fact that you and I met this way. Your platform does an awesome, awesome job of storytelling. And again, this might actually be the central tension, I think, between patients and oncologists. And I'll tell you what I mean, is that we love numbers, we love data. And the way our studies are set up, we're supposed to look for statistical power, right? We need big enough numbers to be sure that our conclusions are generalizable. In the process, though, we discard individual experiences. So N equals 1, right? There's very, very few studies that you're going to predicate just based on the experience of one person. And unfortunately, what that's led to is we get all like myopic about the numbers and the graphs, and we forget about the people. And one of the things I've also tweeted about and written about is, that survival curve I mentioned earlier, every time it notches down, we've lost somebody. And, we need these graphics to be able to visualize the data. but sometimes I stare at them and I'm like, especially when they plunge, you're like, that was people dying, and that's where stories are so important. And the other person I quoted, be very careful doing this. So Joseph Stalin, a weird person to end with, I know, said, a single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. And I think that's so powerful. And I actually I've talked about that a lot because he's right. Like, we are narrative creatures. Like a story like resonates with us. Like most of our entertainment is about narrative. And then when you hear someone's experience the way that your platform allows, it's so resonant. And then when we take that and put it in numerical form, it's like we've cut away the human husk. We're left with this kernel of information, but we can't have discarded that person's humanity in the process. So that, I think, actually, in my mind, especially when I go to these meetings, that's the disconnect. And that's where I feel really lucky, because I'm occasionally given a podium or a microphone and I get to speak up as a patient. And again, I've been very demonstrative on Twitter. I loved it when someone said I was performative. I was like, well, I didn't go through pancreas surgery, to gain clout.
Right.
And I think anybody can call you performative. I think anyone can say you're virtue signaling. These are often very telling accusations about the person who's slinging mud at you, but regardless, it is really nice as a patient. I feel very privileged. I feel privileged to talk to you. I also feel privileged to talk to my peers. And I am not I'm the farthest thing from the world's greatest researcher. I'm actually not very good at the really, really rigorous clinical trials that are going to move the field forward. But what I try to do is speak up if I see us focusing so much on effectiveness or some metric by which we assess it, and forget about the patients. And again, that goes back to toxicity and what you were saying earlier about how do we balance out, longevity and quality of life. That's the whole point, is that we want both. We really want both.
Yeah, you can't have one without the other. And I think that's what you're getting at. And I so appreciate that you are helping to push this forward as part of the paradigm shift.
Right.
The shared decision making in treatment, the fight against having to be a good patient, and all of that, and the fact that so much of the field has focused on the quantitative, but the qualitative is just incredibly important in a whole nother way. So really appreciate you, as Mark, as Dr. Lewis. I look forward to more conversations that we will have. And so
I look forward to that too, Stephanie. Thank you so much. Again, as a patient, feel so thrilled to be on your platform. And as a doctor, it's important for me to soften our image a little bit and make us, fractionally less scary. And hopefully, we can talk more about that next time.
Absolutely. And again, your handle on Twitter is?
Very boring. It's Mark Lewis, MD, MARKLEWIS, MD.
Perfect. And we'll drop that in a graphic as well. So everyone, you'll catch Dr. Mark Lewis's interview and our conversation at thepatientstory.com.